Podemos iniciar.
Buenas tardes con todas y todos los presentes. La especialidad de Historia de la Facultad de Letras y Ciencias Humanas les da la bienvenida a una nueva edición de las Jornadas Historiográficas, que lleva por título en esta ocasión Perú, Chile and the Pacific, Collaborative and Parallel Histories, a cargo del doctor Joshua Savala, quien se encargará de exponer sus recientes investigaciones sobre el tema. Joshua Savala es un historiador norteamericano y obtuvo su bachiller en Historia y Sociología por la Universidad de California, Davis, y posteriormente su maestría en la Universidad de Tufts y la Universidad de Cornell. Finalmente obtuvo su doctorado en Historia en esta última casa de estudios. Actualmente se desempeña como profesor auxiliar en el Departamento de Historia de Rollins College, así como director de su programa de estudios latinoamericanos y caribeños. Finalmente, este año ha publicado su primer libro titulado Beyond Patriotic Phobias, Connections, Cooperation and the Solidarity in the Peruvian, Chilean, Pacific World, investigación que será motivo de reflexión de la presente jornada historiográfica. Doctor Zavala, puedes comenzar tu presentación y muchas gracias nuevamente por su participación aquí.
Well, bueno, voy a presentar en inglés, si está bien. First, I'd like to thank Mariana Cruz Francesca and the other students for inviting me to give this talk. It's always great when students are the kind of people who want to see this or talk about and discuss these new things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Okay, so on June 6, 2022, President of Peru, Pedro Castillo, wrote a 3-tweet thread on the returning of the military epaulets that belonged to Francisco Bolognesi by the Chilean government. Now, of course, anybody who's familiar with the War of the Pacific is familiar with Bolognesi and his efforts to fend off the Chilean military in the port of Arica, and that he died in this effort. Members of the Chilean state after the war had taken plenty of different things from the Peruvian state, things like paintings and statues, archival documents and books, just to give a couple of examples. And many of these things have only been returned to Peru in recent years. In his tweets, President Castillo called attention to both the nationalism of Bolognesi, as well as this returning of materials as a kind of marker of friendship between the two governments. So I'll put up the 2 other tweets that came along with this one. And what I think is interesting about these 2 other tweets here is not so much the kind of words that Castillo is using in order to kind of relay this information. Rather, the reason why I'm bringing these up is because I think that we can use some of the replies to these tweets to think a little bit about nationalism and patriotism across the last 2 centuries. So if we look, for instance, some of the replies to some of this thread of tweets, we see multiple things happening. For instance, people questioning the very patriotism of Castillo himself, of Castillo's lack of honor, of it being a kind of a sad day that Bolognesi's materials were returned under his presidency. And I think some of these tweets also, not the ones necessarily I'm showing here, but some of the other ones would absolutely qualify as racist in some way, shape, or form. But the overwhelming idea here, though, right, is that there's a kind of lack of patriotism on the part of Castillo, particularly lack of patriotism with respect to Bolognesi as a patriotic person. And I'm not really that interested here to kind of Castillo's own politics, viewing Peruvian politics from afar. I can see via Twitter and periodicals and newspapers that there's a wide variety of opinions on this. But I think these comments, if we use them in a particular way, and I think one person who has done so is Paulo Junot in his Website of Memory article looking at YouTube comments on a documentary on the War of the Pacific, we can get a kind of certain collective idea of the past. And in particular, the tweets questioning Castillo's patriotism reveal that across the political spectrum, many hold on to an idea of nationalism that is founded in the War of the Pacific. And this is where I kind of want to depart a little bit from some of this major narratives. And I want to think a little bit about what it might mean to write a kind of anti-nationalist history of Peru and Chile, or what it might mean to write a history of Peru and Chile from the perspective of the Pacific. Now, of course, much ink has been spilled with respect to the history of the War of the Pacific. Reading about it today, one would it would probably take years and years just to cover some of the basic literature. But also, this isn't actually something that's terribly new either. Back in 1925, a writer for the South Pacific Mail, an English language newspaper based out of Valparaiso, Chile, he wrote that even then, it would take a lifetime to cover all the ins and outs of the War of the Pacific. And this may have been an exaggeration on their part, but I think there's a point there, right? And in the field of history, of course, the war has also been a central point of discussion for a number of people across a number of different topics and disciplines across the decades. In particular, though, I want to mention one debate that I'm sure all of you here are very familiar with, and that's a debate between these three scholars right here. Right. Now, this starts way back in the 1970s and then goes into the 1990s. And in 2014, Bonilla's book kind of returns to some of these discussions from back in the day, right? And it's hard. This was a discussion about how to conceptualize the nation and nationalism, in my opinion. And I think scholars now will kind of lean one side or the other. Yet one of the presuppositions of Bonilla, Manrique, and Mellon is that the relationship between Peru, however one wants to kind of conceptualize what Peru is or was in the late 19th century, the relationship between Peru and Chile is one of conflict. In other words, a conflictual relationship between Peru and Chile is the kind of basis from which their study begins. And if we look at many other final works on this period in Peruvian history, the War of the Pacific is either the end of the study or the very beginning of the study. And I argue that this tendency to periodize the War of the Pacific as kind of new era in Peruvian history, it reproduces, even if unintentionally, the idea that the only way to think about Peru-Chile relationships is through conflict. And so this presupposing of conflict, in turn, I think closes off the possibilities of rethinking this relationship, and it closes off the possibility of telling other histories. So what happens then if we bracket the war and conflict and let the archival documents speak for themselves? If we don't assume conflict and we are open to the idea of collaboration? And this question is the kind of fundamental idea behind my book, which, as Mariana mentioned at the very beginning, just came out a few months ago. Will be on patriotic phobias, published at the University of California Press. And what I'd like to do today is take a couple of examples from the book, talk about them, and then hopefully at the end we can have a conversation. So for me, the Pacific framework is key. Just as there has been plenty written on the War of the Pacific, many who have studied the Peru-Chile relationship have done so from the geography of Tacna Arica. And I think this makes plenty of sense considering the contested politics in the region. My push, though, is to kind of use a Pacific framework. And this geographical reorientation means that we have to look at port cities along the South American Pacific littoral, ships circulating in or around the Pacific, and how all this relates back to the different places and parts of each individual country. We need to, in turn, draw from comparative oceanic studies to rethink the South American Pacific. So here and throughout the talk, I'm going to kind of mention some books that have been, or papers that have been important for me. But I think one of the fundamental things that has been kind of driving my research here is that we have to think of the Pacific as a fundamentally cosmopolitan place. Like the people working in many of these ships came from any number of different countries, so that even if a ship flew the flag of Peru, the actual people on the ship working it came from places like England and Mexico and Ecuador and Chile. So I want to show a couple of tables that come from the book. So here we see the Peruvian ship Amazonas from 1863 went to Valparaiso and Iquique to pick up new workers. And as you can see in the table here, these are folks coming from all over the place, mostly from Chile and England in this case, but also from other places like the Philippines and Italy. Here we have another table. This comes from the census material from Callao from 1905 and 1920. And what we see in this is that we have people living in Callao in the first decade of the 20th century that are from all across the world. Now, as a percentage of the total population, they were not too large, around 10% of the total population of Callao in 1905, and just over 8% in 1920. Still, though, I think that these numbers of people in Callao would have shaped the makeup of the city itself. And if we move beyond just thinking about it as a cosmopolitan place with respect to people outside of Peru, we can see that the Pacific was also a place in which people from within Peru probably met each other for the first time. So two more tables, if you don't mind, y'all. So here's that same exact Amazonas ship from 1863, when it picked up workers in Callao. It picked up 40 workers, 40 Peruvians in Callao. And of those 40, 33 of them came from other parts of Peru that were not Callao or Lima. I think that's a significant number of people, right? In the second table here, we can see the Peruvians living in Callao in 1905 and 1920. And again, we can see that Peruvians living in Callao came from all over the country. So my point here is that the South American Pacific was a space of both international and intranational mixing. So it's helpful if we think of port cities like Callao, or in this case, or another case about Valparaíso, as meeting points from people between people from around the world and from within each country. But I think that to leave the Pacific as simply the cosmopolitan space is a bit too abstract. I think we have to take another step, and that next step, for me at least, is to think about gender. This was an overwhelmingly masculine space. Right? Ship crews and port workers were a force of people made up almost entirely of men. And here I take a lot of inspiration from the British geographer Doreen Massey in her Space, Place, and Gender book. And writing about a totally different context, she says that this was a space given over or entirely given over to men. So conceptually, we must view, I think, the construction of particular ideas about masculinity in conjunction with the spatial arrangements within which people labored and lived. What does this mean on a kind of more empirical, archival sense? Well, for me, this means that we have to think about the oceanic sphere in ways that people have in other kind of highly masculine labor spots. For instance, Thomas Miller-Klubach's wonderful book on masculinity and contested communities about a copper mine in Chile, and examine how work regimes, neighborhoods, and labor unions all help to form what it meant to be a man. And to do this, I think we can read broadly for sources. In my book, I examine court cases, for instance, as well as periodicals from the era. But one of the things that was extremely helpful to me has been the semi-autobiographical novels and stories of the Chilean writer Manuel Rojas. In this short novel from 1932, titled Lanchas en la Bahía, Rojas tells the story of Eugenio, a new port worker in Valparaíso, and the men and women, mostly as sex workers, that he meets there. At one point, a co-worker named Rusio del Norte hears the childlike voice of Eugenio and quickly begins to teach him how to speak like a man. And in this brief exchange, we see how one male worker teaches another male worker what it means to be not only a man, but a working class man, and one who uses their muscles in particular ways. Now, we could go on about masculinity and gender ideologies, but I also want to focus, or for a brief moment at least, on sexuality in the Pacific. And to do so, we could return to writers like Manuel Rojas, whose work is filled with references to sexuality. But for our case here, what I'd like to do is talk about one letter written in 1910 by Antonio Agacio, who was working in the Chilean consulate in Panama. He wrote to Santiago about something he was extremely worried about. I'm going to just highlight some of these points in the letter here, right? So he's worried about the desarrollo del vicio de sodomía que se observa en nuestra marina mercante. Over the course of his career, he had known of many cases of male-male sex on board Chilean ships. But in 1910, one of the things that caused such concern was not necessarily that men were having sex with other men, but rather who these men were. And in this case, in 1910, he was very concerned that Chilean men were having sex with Peruvian men. This was so worrying to him that he actually suggested that this is going to affect the virility of the Chilean race. And he claims that there's two reasons for this male-male sex between Peruvians and Chileans. First, he claimed that this male-male sex began with the War of the Pacific. His suggestion being that when the Chilean military went to Lima and Callao during the War of the Pacific, Peruvian men taught Chilean men how to have sex with other men. Now, of course, this is a rather, ridiculous assertion. I'm pretty confident that Chilean men knew how to have sex with other men prior to the War of the Pacific. But the second part here, I think, is really interesting as well, and that is that he pulls from a definition from an 1894 Spanish dictionary published in Paris. I'm going to give you the extract right here from that letter. Now, in both cases, these arguments pulled, I think, on a much longer history of feminizing men from Peru, and particularly from Lima, especially Afro-Peruvians and indigenous people. And what I find so telling in this letter is that, and again, this kind of returns to the basic argument I'm trying to make here, it shows how regular Peruvians and Chileans, in this case men, engage in affective relationships across the border. Laboring on ships and surrounded by other men, working at port with other men, and with men calling attention to one another's strength and to their muscles, which is something you see quite a bit here, meant that some of these men developed sexual relations with other men. And more than that, and again, despite the idea of eternal conflict between Peruvians and Chileans, is that we see the kind of another way in which collaboration, in this sense, sexual collaboration, happens between Peruvian men and Chilean men. Now, in 2017, I was in Lima and I gave a talk at the Facultad de Historia that focused mostly on anarchist and connections forged between port and maritime workers in Valparaiso, Chile, and Mollendo, Peru. Fundamentally, I argue that the politics of anarchism, in conjunction with how they viewed and thought about the political openness of the Pacific, allowed for workers in both ports to enact labor organizing that was more concerned with winning local gains, as well as eventually the overthrow of capitalism in general, that they're more concerned with that than reproducing the kind of nationalist division between Peruvians and Chileans. And this article in turn became something I published in Hispanic American Historical Review in 2019, and is the basis for chapter 4 of my book. But since that piece is kind of there as an article, I don't want to kind of stick too much to it. Rather, what I'd like to do is talk about cholera and a cholera outbreak in Chile from 1886 to 1888. And this forms the basis of my third chapter of the book. So in November of 1886, residents of the Chilean port city of Valparaiso began to read stories about cholera crossing the Atlantic coast to South America. Published in the main daily of the country are short articles in El Mercurio relating the number of dead in certain areas, the precautions prescribed for the population, and measures different Atlantic states took in order to fend off cholera. The public read about new policies in Brazil and Argentina, and those who did not know how to read surely saw something was happening because of the new sanitation procedures that were put into place in Valparaiso. Now, in my reading of recent studies on cholera, they've tried to kind of place this in a larger framework about social and political difference. Within one country, for instance, scholars can use cholera to bring into relief class and or racial differences, for instance. And I think these have helped us to really think about the interrelationship between hierarchy and medicine. But what I'm trying to do here is do something a little bit different. I'm pulling a lot of influence here from Eric Tagliacozzo's work, to Southeast Asianist, and has written a book about the Hajj to Mecca by Southeast Asians, as well as an excellent article on the unification of the globe by disease. And Huber's research, I think, is really interesting, right? She argues that diseases such as cholera both united the world by spreading from place to place, literally connecting the globe through transmission, and united the globe against the spread of cholera itself. So instead of using cholera as a kind of wedge, as a way of thinking about hierarchy and difference, my aim is to show how cholera acted as a binder, as a way of kind of bringing together medical professionals in two different countries and forming one community. The fear of cholera spreading brought people together, what I'm arguing here, across political boundaries. So Chilean authorities in Santiago, for obvious reasons, sought to protect the country from cholera. And when news broke out about the kind of spreading of cholera to the western provinces of Argentina, in particular the word about Mendoza, they instituted a new kind of closing off of all communication between Argentina and Chile on December 4th, 1886. And within the press, some said this was a power move, saying the newly elected president, Jose Manuel had kind of overstepped his power. Others, particularly the Valparaiso edition of El Mercurio and La Unión, supported the move as a kind of necessary measure to save the residents of Chile. But closing a border is much easier said than done. So just 2 days after the order was done, we see a letter in the archive in Chile from Eulogio Allende from the city of Talca, which is about 250 kilometers south of Santiago. And in this letter to the Ministry of the Interior, he requested that they send 20 men to Talca to help stop the traffic across the Andes. I wasn't able to find any reply to this request for new people, but it suggests the grand efforts of workers, of clothing, of money, of transportation, of room and board that would have been required in order to actually close off a border, such as that between Argentina and Chile. And despite these efforts, cholera began its destructive course in San Felipe, a town just under 90 kilometers north of Santiago, by the end of December. Meanwhile, the Peruvian state began to receive cables from Chile about the spread of cholera. How they were to respond depended on a long history of medical studies across the 19th century, as well as local experiences with other diseases, with other sicknesses, in particular yellow fever. But two things that many of these studies agreed upon were the following. One, that Callao was inherently problematic in terms of diseases, that environmentally and the way that people have interacted with the port itself had caused it to be a kind of hotspot for the reproduction of diseases. And second, their main thing was that the threat of cholera was going to arrive on ships. Now, people in Callao couldn't do much about the location of their port, but they could institute new regulations on shipping. And that's exactly what they did. They recreated or reformulated a sanitary commission which restricted ships arriving from parts of Chile that they had determined had recently had cholera outbreaks. But just like the case of the Chilean state trying to restrict information coming from Argentina, Peruvian authorities ran into a number of problems with these new rules. So when the Washington, which was an Italian steamship, arrived to Callao, it was placed into quarantine, but the local press quickly published articles claiming that people in Callao had breached the quarantine. In another case, the Peruvian state created its own kind of loopholes. So the Coquimbo steamship was allowed to dock in Callao, even though it had come from Valparaiso, which just recently had a cholera cases, and even though it carried with it an unclear unclean bill of health, a patente sucia. And the reason that this ship was allowed to dock, well, the people who wrote the quarantine and the sanitation rules said that if a ship contained goods from Europe, they would be kind of allowed to dock. So they created their own kind of loopholes for these conditions. And one of the things I'd like to suggest here is that, and here I'm following the work of the historian Lauren Benton and the sociologist Renisa Mawani, that these ships were, in a sense, what Benton calls kind of vectors of law thrusting into ocean space. And what I mean by this is that because of the fear of cholera arriving via ships, those ships helped to create new legal regulations. And with these bills of health acting as what Mawani in her work calls technologies of jurisdiction. In these cases, the legal documents produced and signed in Chile held value on board, but authorities in Peru determined, according to their own prerogatives, how to enforce their own medical legal regulations. So it's worthwhile, I think, here to think a little about the ocean and how people at the time were kind of conceptualizing and engaging with it in both Peru and Chile. One of the things I want to push here is that the ocean had two ideas about it. One is the ocean as threat. So not only did authorities in Peru look with caution at ships coming from Chile, they also sought to create a new kind of international system of regulations in regards to how states should interact with shipping in moments of epidemic diseases. So when 7 doctors met up, people at a Lima sanitation conference in 1888, and these are doctors from Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador, they agreed on 136 different articles dealing with cholera. And of these 136 articles, 115 dealt explicitly with policing the maritime border. So in this scenario, the ocean was a threat. It was the space that was going to bring, in this case, cholera to any particular state, and therefore should be regulated and controlled. But the ocean, in a way, kind of acted as a savior in another sense. So the intendant of Valparaiso proposed a plan to pump ocean water into the small hills surrounding this port city. And from there, the water would kind of flow down from the top of the hills through the ravines and different streets and take with it the hygienic threats to the city. So in this scenario, the ocean was seen quite literally as a kind of cleansing force. So cholera and the fear of spreading northward via ships invigorated a kind of part of state formation in both Peru and Chile. And at this point in the 1880s, scientists were still debating the exact life of cholera, of what it was and of how it spread. And what authorities in Peru and Chile did know, though, was that they needed to do something in order to protect their populations. And part of this meant creating new material objects to help in this effort. So in both Peru and Chile, they built new quarantine stations. And in Chile, the state set up new telephone lines in order to relay information more rapidly about outbreaks. What I'd like to suggest then is that although we know much more about the kind of cultural forms of state formation coming mostly out of the 1990s and some of the historical scholarship produced then, we also, I think, have to emphasize how material things help to create the state as well, right? Were essential in this process of state formation. This is me kind of calling back to a much older literature here. Yeah, I don't want to suggest that all people were totally fine with these new regulations, right? In one case in Valparaiso, I ran across a letter of protest from fruit vendors who were very upset that the intendant had banned the sale of fruit. But in other cases, what we do see are people kind of asking the state to do stuff for them. So we see this, for instance, in the port of Arica. And here we see members of diplomatic missions, merchants, port workers, and others, a total of 96 people who signed this petition, asking for the central government to institute a ban on the docking of all ships coming from south of Arica. So the argument here is that rather than what I think has been kind of the norm in recent years is seeing the kind of state as a necessarily oppressive institution, that it can also be something that was kind of inviting in, that the local population invited the state in order to help them. So turning towards the medical community, it would have been an impossibility for doctors in Lima to not have known the devastation of the War of the Pacific. It hit quite close to home to many of them, since the Chilean military used their medical school as a station during the occupation of Lima. And because of that, I think that would have been really easy for doctors to kind of form a kind of hermetic seal against Chilean medicine. But with the threat of cholera reaching Peru, doctors in Lima and in Peru more broadly knew that they had to work with their Chilean counterparts to stop or at least impede the spread of cholera. So throughout these years, doctors exchanged medical studies, sending them across state lines, and they also exchanged people. So in 1887, the Peruvian state commissioned the young doctor David Mato to visit Chile to conduct research on cholera. Now, this cholera outbreak and the career of Mato is also discussed in a chapter by Marcos Cueto and Betty Rivera in the edited volume that you see on the left here. And my argument here isn't to go against what they wrote. It's rather to kind of build on what they had previously researched and wrote about. And it's also to place Mato firmly into this kind of transnational medical community. Now, it's unclear what Mato thought about the prospect of being sent to Chile to do research in the middle of a cholera outbreak. But we do get a sense of what some other doctors in Peru thought. One of them, for instance, wrote of Mato's journey as fulfilling the glory of our national medicine. Now, oddly enough, this discourse of Peruvian national medicine as a glory ignored the fact that this was medical research being done abroad. In a sense, national medicine required, particularly in the case of cholera research in the 1880s, required national or transnational medicine. So Mato stayed in Chile from December 87 to July of 1888, during which he traveled to numerous cities, sent information on cholera back to Peru, and conducted research with Chilean doctors. Mato went into great detail on the specifics of the Chilean state's procedures, as well as the state structure to deal with cholera. In one case, Mato described the disinfection methods, conducting house visits, and the functioning and material composition of quarantine sites. And this type of transnational reporting by Mato reveals, or it kind of reads as a how-to or how not to guide for state officials in Peru. So if the spread of cholera in Chile was acted as kind of a catalyst to certain parts of Chilean state formation, these telephone lines I mentioned earlier, for instance, these actions, as reported by Mato back to Lima, put into motion similar processes in Peru. And this is kind of part of what I'm trying to gesture towards here with respect to the kind of parallel histories. One of the most important parts of this research, I suggest, was his work with a Chilean doctor named Carlos Killing. They worked side by side in the same laboratory. They collected cholera samples together, and they viewed them through the exact same Zeiss-equipped microscope. And this is extremely important for me because Mato had traveled to Chile without any type of scientific instrument. In one letter, he says that he didn't even have a watch glass, much less a microscope. Thus, Mato's research required a close relationship with Chilean doctors and their instruments. So again, just as I mentioned earlier, that the state needed material things to become a state, the relationship between Killing and Mato required the sharing of not only a laboratory, but also a microscope. It required those material things to actually function. And instructive here, I think, is Mato's description of cholera, something that he repeatedly refers to as kind of tiny beings. So I'm going to put the quote on the screen here if you'd like to read it. And what I think is important here is his language in describing cholera gets to one of the kind of core arguments in this chapter, that cholera itself was a kind of major historical actor during this time period. And I'm not trying to suggest that cholera has like a brain and is, self-conscious and wants to do historical acts or anything like that, but rather that because of the way that medical professionals were interpreting cholera, because they didn't know how it functioned necessarily, or kind of as a whole, that they in turn acted and changed the historical trajectory because of how they thought about cholera. Now, one thing that's important here too, to kind of take a moment to think about, is that this forming of a transnational medical community was also a gendered experience. So in the case of Chile, we can look, for instance, at the historian Maria Soledad Zarate's work. She has pointed out that in the 1885 census in Chile, of the 625 doctors on record, only 12 of them were women. Doctors in Chile, in turn, were part of this kind of rather homosocial world in which the man of science meant just that it was a man. And we see something rather similar in the case of the gendered aspects of the Peruvian medical community. So while the forming these bonds between Mato and the Chilean medical community is important because of its sidestepping of the nationalist divisions of the era, just a few years after the end of the War of the Pacific, it was also made possible by the fact that this was a rather gendered world of medicine, and a masculine one at that. So after a month of working together, Mato and Chilean finally prepared or performed an autopsy of a person who had recently died because of cholera. On January 13th, 1888, only 10 minutes after the person passed away, Mato began to collect intestinal contents, and Chilean worked on the culture. The results paralleled the recent work undertaken by research at the Naval School in the port, so much so that Mato sent back an image captured by them, and he sent it back to Lima. This isn't necessarily the picture he sent back, but this is a picture from a book published by the researchers at the Naval School. And at one point in describing some of the processes used in the lab, Mato resorted to the use of analogy. I'm going to put the quote here on the board. Now, this might have been a simple kind of flourish of the pen, but what I think is happening here is this kind of use of analogy, right, of the pasa and the uva, two things that Peruvian researchers would recognize and that process would recognize, and he's using this analogy to relate an unfamiliar researching technique to people in a new way, right? That this kind of use of analogy is actually part of this this moment in the transnational history of medicine. So when Mato returned to Lima in July of 1888, he wrote of his deep appreciation for his Chilean counterparts. And in his last published letter on cholera, Mato wrote of the professionalism and friendship extended to him by the Chilean medical community. And this is, I suggest, the creation of what the scholar Lila Gandhi has called kind of the creation of an affective community, wherein people choose friend over country. So in the months of research, Mato and his Chilean counterparts practiced medical research much more concerned, much more interested in protecting people from cholera, regardless of national origin, than kind of reproducing that conflictual relationship. And this is kind of in my phrasing in the chapter, what I'm trying to call a kind of science without a nation. So the months of research in Chile seems to have affected Mato and how he conceptualized medicine. If during his time working with Carlos Quillen in a laboratory in Vina del Mar, he observed cholera as tiny beings, this vision of the microbe world remained with Mato in years to come. In 1891, Mato finished his doctoral thesis on tetanus. And in his introductory remarks, Mato resorted to a language describing medical researchers examining bacteria that was remarkably similar to his phrasing discussing cholera. And I'm putting up the way he talked about it right here. And if you notice, again, he resorts to the kind of infinitely small, these tiny beings situation, right? And he even talked about them and the research as, or the process as them interviewing these tiny beings. So in later years, Mato remained committed to some type of cooperative relationship with Chile. From December 1908 to 1909, or January 1909, scientists from across the Americas met in Santiago, Chile, for the 4th Latin American Scientific Congress. In preparation for the Congress, Mato wrote a brief book titled La Enseñanza América en el Perú. Although it was a broad work of synthesis, Mato also referenced treaties that Peru held with various countries that allowed for medical training to transfer from one place to the other. And in particular, he looked towards Chile, who had signed an agreement with Peru in December of 1907, and he included the entirety of the treaty in his appendix. And in this, he applauded this attempt to unify the study of medicine, the research into medicine across the Americas, of this finding equivalences. And he said that this is the idea, the ideal that we should all be aspiring towards, people of the Americas, both of the North and of the South. So to wrap up, I want to return to kind of the main arguments, right? That the example of cholera in medicine shows that despite the nationalist tensions in the direct aftermath of a brutal war, Peruvians and Chileans did in fact create relationship of cooperation and solidarity. Since much of the literature on Peru and Chile emphasizes conflict, I think this is, for me at least, hopefully kind of challenges some of the emphasis on conflict. And I think beyond this, on a methodological note, I think it is necessary to take seriously the oceanic connections of the Pacific. Throughout the book, the ocean as historical space comes in and out, being very highlighted in some chapters and kind of in the background in others. But the idea of water connecting people is also useful for thinking through transnational histories. Indeed, as somebody we've all probably read at some point in our history journey, as Burdell once suggested in the English preface to the English edition, right? That the sea can reveal a kind of shared common destiny. And I think that's my time for them. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Savala. We will now move on to the round of questions from the audience. And first we have a question. Usually the historiographic discourse was rounded around the perspective, the nationalist perspective to study and teaching the War of Pacific. Having this in mind, how can we move on from this view, and what did motivate you to investigate the solidarity connections between Peruvians and Chileans in post-war?
Yes, thank you. So maybe I'll start with the why does a kid from California, from Southern California, decide to study Peru and Chile, and this kind of connection. And that I would say is, before the meeting started today, we're talking about Charles Walker, about Chuck, and I had done a study abroad with him in Cusco years and years ago, and I had a friend there from Cusco, and I mentioned to her that I was going to Chile the next semester in order to learn Spanish, or get an in-depth study of Spanish. And her first question was, why are you going to Chile to learn Spanish? They can barely speak Spanish there. I said, well, being that as it may, I still think it's important, right? So, and I kind of always had this kind of like, oh, there's this kind of back and forth situation there. And so I said, I should look into this. And initially I came at it from the perspective of the history of anarchism, which is a topic of interest to me, as you can see with some of the book and some of my previously published work. But then it kind of just like expanded out, right, to look at all these different pieces. And at the very beginning of the talk today, I kind of mentioned allowing the archival documents to really kind of lead the story, right? And as I did that, I kind of expanded out from just port and maritime workers to think a little bit about medicine, to think a little bit about doctors, to think about police and policing, which is the subject of the last chapter of the book. So for me, I think seeing those things, allowing archival documents to kind of push the actual research. But also, I think that it's important to politically to push back against some of these nationalist narratives that can be extremely harmful to, I think, kind of contemporary politics, but also kind of the way that we think about history and the possibilities of imagining a different world. I think that's a really important piece to why I do what I do. In terms of teaching, I teach when I do teach the War of the Pacific in my classes here. One, most students have no idea what the War of the Pacific is, so I get them fresh. They had, just doing their own thing. They know very little about Peru. They know very little about Chile. So I teach both parts of it, right? I teach the nationalist part. I teach the debates that happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And then I go on from there and show that there are other ways of thinking about this. And for me, it's important to do so not only because there were other ways of interacting, but because it's also part of the historical method, right? To not allow some of those presupposed ideas to structure and determine the types of sources we read and how we read those particular sources. Hopefully that gets at it.
No, thanks a lot. Well, now we have another question. How did the medical knowledge of the time and theories of disease transmission translate into high civilian deaths during the war, considering that this event took place in both urban and rural settings? Was healthcare a priority of the governments of the time?
That's a great question. I think to an extent, it happens at a moment in the Chilean case, at least with this new president, Balmaceda, is a moment in which the state is starting to attempt to insert itself into people's lives in a much more deep way compared to previously. So under Balmaceda's presidency, we see things like this. We also see the expansion of public schools. And these are kind of two ways in which the state and the people involved with it are finally saying, hey, you know what? We should be doing more for like common people, right? We should be doing more for those who have been marginalized. And so I think that they're using those things in conjunction in order to kind of to show some care for people. And it might have been more focused in certain parts on urban populations, but we do see, so for instance, Mato, one of the things that he does is he travels with another important doctor, Chilean doctor, to certain parts of rural southern Chile, where he reports back to Lima about what was happening in these rural parts compared to the urban parts. And one of the things that he notes is how you can almost track the spread of cholera according to railroad lines and how it spread across on railroads. And so for me, my interpretation of that is a kind of, we have to understand how it spreads, but also there's like this kind of almost veiled critique or kind of a double way of thinking about railroads is, yes, it helps us ship things. Yes, it helps us move people, but also just like ships and shipping and steamships, all that kind of stuff, it also can spread disease. It also can kind of function in such a way. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both in that sense. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier too, because in the 1880s, we're barely getting some of the Koch research coming out of Germany about how cholera functioned. But so because it happens directly in that exact same moment, within the medical world, there's still intense debates about, is Koch right? Or is this older theory of cholera the correct one? And because medical doctors in both Peru and Chile are not sure, they're still wondering about it, they themselves kind of just take their best interpretation and say, that's interpretation that's right for now, and that's how we're going to respond to it.
Thank you again. Okay, we have a question from Michelle Lacoste. She says, hello from New Haven. Thanks for this conference, has been really enriching. I would like to ask you, why did you not study the previous relation between Chile and Peru, for example, the collaboration during Independence War?
Yeah, so I didn't today I didn't, and in the book I don't do that very much, but I do mention some previous collaboration, not so much during the Independence War, but during the 1860s, when Spain is trying to kind of recolonize in a sense because of guano and whatnot along the Peruvian coast, and this kind of collaboration that's happening at that point. So there are elements there. I was also trying to not write a 300 or 400 page book, basically, trying to keep it relatively concise in terms of the time periods that I was looking at. I thought that going back towards independence would have been maybe another volume entirely. So yes, it does exist, it's there, but that wasn't the focus of my particular aim.
Yeah. Then we have another question, and it says, have you been able to develop the role of the charities in the role of welfare and care for soldiers and common people during the war period? By whom were they financially supported?
No, that's a great question. And I think so for instance, in the Chilean case, if you read newspapers from the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century, you'll see repeated references to these kind of veterans groups from the war and how they're not being taken care of in the proper way, and how they're starting to organize into social groups in order to kind of push for some type of relief from the Chilean state. Initially, I thought that could have been a route to study. In the end, I didn't. I think while I was in Chile doing the research, maybe while I was in Peru doing the research, somebody published a book about the veterans of the War of the Pacific, and I decided, okay, I'm going to let that book kind of stand on its own and not try to get into that territory. So in the end, I didn't look at the actual veterans of the War of the Pacific. Although I think whoever asked that question, I think you're completely right that there's plenty more to be done on that particular topic in the future. So if you have the desire, I say go for it.
Sorry, we have another question. The trade of cholera from Chile in the context of the reorganization of an export economy and maritime trade in the period of the national reconstruction led to the development of a series of sanitary measures in Peru and the convening of the American Sanitary Congress. What are your views on this affirmation, and what other measures were taken by the government on this period after war?
Yeah, so if anybody's interested, that the results of that conference are online somewhere. I can't remember where, but you can find it pretty easily. But they have all kinds of measures with respect to what types of ships can come, who can come, like how do you determine which ports were actually affected or not affected by a particular disease. We also see some stuff about spreading via rivers, also land borders. So on the one hand, I think that some of the measures that they take stand for a while, but then if you look at quarantine situations that are happening in the 1910s or the first decade of the 1900s, we see them entering into these exact same discussions over and over again. So while they do put into place some new measures and they do create some new stuff, some new quarantines or lazaretos in different parts, not everything is done to the best of each state's ability, right? On the one hand, I think this is a product of both states still being relatively weak states and not having the funds and not having the ability to complete some of these things. In one case, I found a lazareto that they began to build, and then like a decade later, they're still trying to build it, even though cholera had already passed by a number of years. On the other hand, I think this is also a product of capitalism more broadly. And what I mean by that is, in order for capitalism to function, there has to be a continual circulation of goods, right? There has to continually send things. And so behind all of these debates, and sometimes within all these debates, is the question of, okay, we need to protect our people, but we also need to ship things. We also need to send things from Chile to Peru or vice versa, or from Peru to other parts of the world. And so we have to have some types of measures, but we also need for circulation to happen. And I think this makes the regulations kind of ebb and flow in the coming decades. And that discussion of we need things to circulate, we need to sell goods, but we also need to protect our populations is something that I'm sure that everybody's familiar with now after 3 years of COVID, of that exact same discussion and debate of we need to protect people, but we also need commerce. We also need goods to flow.
Thanks a lot. Okay. After the end of the war, can we point to an overcoming of miasmatic and bacteriological theories at the end of the century? Is it possible to speak of an effort to modernize and standardize maritime health on the Pacific coast?
Oh yes, I'm liking these questions, y'all. This is precisely the thing, right? Is that some were still kind of thinking about miasmas. They're still thinking about that kind of way of doing medicine and where diseases come from. I think that somebody should write this book because I think that there is something there, right? In terms of how these different states are conceptualizing different ways of doing medicine in the Pacific in the late 19th century. Who should write that book? I don't know, not me, but somebody in this audience who asked that question, I think should write that book or that article, because I think there is something there, right? Because all of these measures, all these ways of thinking about it are also interrelated to Pacific migration, right? They're related to people coming from East Asia in particular, going to the Americas as indentured labor. They're related to, in the case of the 1860s, they're related to what H.E. Maude called slaving in paradise with respect to the Peruvian and Chilean ships going into Oceania and the Pacific in order to enslave Pacific Islanders and bring them back to Peru. One of the things that they're always concerned about is that some of these folks are ending up in hospitals because they're sick as soon as they arrive and then are passing away there. So I think that there is something larger here happening in the Pacific with respect to medicine and how people and different states are conceptualizing what it means to do medicine at this particular point. And that's maybe where I would leave it for now.
Okay. To sum up, how could health regulations be reflected in the following bubonic plague epidemic at the beginning of the 20th century, which was mainly port-related? Do you see any changes or continuities?
Yeah, this was precisely what we see happening, right? In the early decades of the 20th century, in the Chilean case, we see again quarantines, sanitation stations, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we do see that changes is simply with bubonic plague, but also in particular yellow fever, is the kind of directionality of some of this, right? So in the cholera case of the 1880s, some people in Chile are upset. Well, people in Chile are initially upset, or was this? So the cholera gets to Brazil and Argentina. They try to set up kind of a closed-off border with Argentina, and the Argentines are upset by this, right? And then it gets to Chile, and Peru's trying to set off particular regulations with respect to shipping from Chile, and the Chileans are upset by it, even though they had just done the exact same thing to Argentina. Yellow fever, it's the exact opposite because it's coming more so from Central America and from the north downwards. So Peruvians are setting up, or yellow fever is arriving to Peru, and then Chile is signing up particular types of quarantines or restrictions for Peruvian shipping. Peruvians are obviously upset by this, or some are, and the Chileans don't see, there's no kind of thinking about the paradox or the kind of contradiction of all these things happening over and over again, but just the directionality of it changing from north to south or south to north. But this is, as I mentioned earlier, right? This is something that's going to be ongoing throughout the early parts of the 20th century with respect to how to actually deal with some of these things. I think in the Peruvian case in particular, Patricia Palma has written recently about quarantines and sanitation stations in the Peruvian. And this is, I think, something that she notices, right? That there are some shifts and changes, but there's also a lot of continuity for how this is actually functioning across the end of the 19th into the early 20th centuries.
Well, okay. Once again, we thank you, Professor Savala, for your interesting intervention in the Jornadas Historiográficas. Thank you very much also for answering questions from the audience, and we extend the invitation to the public to stay tuned for the next edition of the Jornadas Historiográficas. Muchas gracias a todos nuevamente por su participación y esperamos verlos pronto en una próxima jornada historiográfica. Y muchas gracias, profesor Savala, nuevamente por su participación aquí.
Thank you very much.
Nos damos por concluida la jornada del día de hoy y agradecemos a todos pues, que hayan venido. Muchas gracias. Cuídense. ¿Cómo se llama?